late last week, about 3,000 passengers were able to disembark a cruise ship known as the Ruby Princess in Sydney. They were given clearance to do so. In the subsequent days, it's now been revealed that 26 of those on board the Ruby Princess have now been tested for coronavirus. Let's go live back to Canberra now. Michael Outram, the Australian Border Force Commissioner, joins me live now. Commissioner, thank you for your time. Why were infected passengers allowed to disembark that ship?
Well, Laura, without getting into a sort of a blame game, I might explain to you what the actual process is that we've put into place. So all cruise ships, of course, that were still on the water at the time of the ban when it was introduced on the 16th of March, those cruise ships that were either on a round-trip cruise from Australia or heading to Australia were exempted from that ban for the obvious reason we didn't want to strand any vessels at seas. And a lot of Australians are actually passengers on those vessels. So managing those vessels into port becomes important. Now, the masters of those ships are required to report any illness or disease from 96 hours out through the Maritime Arrivals Reporting System to the Department of Agriculture, the Biosecurity Department. We also have access to that information. So when the vessels then come into port, they have to fly a yellow flag to show that they have no quarantinable disease on board as well as a second step. And so when the vessel comes up alongside, what happens is if there's no reports of any disease or illness, in the current arrangements, the passengers, the Australian passengers, are allowed to disembark. They're provided with all the fact sheets, information and declarations about the requirements to self-isolate. The international passengers, of course, they then have to get home. And then it's a matter for the state or territory if they want to keep the passengers on the cruise ship until their flight's available, and we put in place arrangements, of course, with shipping agents for them to get to the airport, or to allow them to go into hotels and self-quarantine until their flights are available. In the case where there's a report of illness on the vessel, then that becomes a matter, of course, for the State and Territory Health Department to manage. So what I've done is put in place an arrangement where, whilst the Border Force's role is customs and immigration clearance for international passengers, I've asked my officers, when they're boarding a ship that's coming from international waters, to ask the master a simple question. Has anyone on this vessel got flu-like symptoms? If the answer is yes, nobody will be getting off that vessel until we've double-checked that the State or Territory Health Department is aware of that, and they can then give their guidance about how they want to manage that.
OK, but we know the incubation period for coronavirus is about 14 days. That's why people are asked to self-isolate for that period of time. So why wasn't testing done, given that we know these cruise ships in recent times have been almost petri dishes for cultivating this virus? Why wasn't everyone on board tested for coronavirus?
Well, I can't answer that question. That's a matter really for New South Wales Health.
Okay.
What I might say is that there was a similar vessel that came into port in Victoria where there were some passengers with flu-like symptoms. All the passengers in that case were held on the vessel until those passengers had been tested, the swabs had been analysed and the results were known. Unfortunately, they were negative, so in that case, the passengers were allowed to disembark.
So what's the difference between Victoria and New South Wales here? Was that the state guidelines that were being followed in Victoria, but they were lax in New South Wales?
Well, what we've done is we've cleared up the protocols with all the states and territories.
Okay.
And there's the process that I stepped you through just a moment ago.
OK, so just to be very clear on this, now that there are cruise ships, if they will dock in Australia, just take us through quickly once again, what is the process? Will they be kept on board for 2 weeks? Will everyone be tested, or will they all have to go straight into self-isolation, just like any overseas passengers arriving at airports are?
So the arrangements for cruise ships, all cruise ships are, if there is no report of any illness on board, that is that all these ships have doctors on board. If there's no reports of anybody on board being ill, then of course there's engagement between the Commonwealth authorities, that's my organisation that does customs and immigration clearance, Department of Agriculture, that does the human biosecurity clearance, and the state and territory. If there's no report of any illness on board, the Australians on that vessel are allowed to go home to self-isolate for 2 weeks, as is the arrangement now with international passengers arriving into Australia through our airports. If there are international passengers on that vessel who need to get home, then either they can self-isolate on the vessel, they can self-isolate in a hotel, but once their flight becomes immediately available, they can be taken direct to the airport to fly home, because there are no reports of illness. If, however, there are reports of illness on the vessel, then of course that becomes a quarantine matter for the State or Territory Health Department to manage in the best way that they see fit.
OK, of the Australians who have just returned from overseas, whether they be on a cruise ship or via air, they are required to self-isolate. What are you doing? What is the Australian Border Force doing to enforce that? Anything?
Well, we enforce the laws at the border. We don't work post borders. We don't go knocking on doors or checking on people, of course. But what we have done is implemented a system whereby all passengers arriving at our airports have to fill in a declaration form. That declaration form requires that they provide also the address where they'll be isolating, the phone number. We require their passport details to be put on there, and they sign a declaration acknowledging and agreeing to self-isolate. Those cards are collected before people go through the smart gates or through the primary line and immigration clearance. So we are then providing all of those documents to the state and territory health departments as a record on a daily basis, well, more than once a day, in fact, several times a day in some cases, that's available to the state and territory health departments so they can contact and check on those passengers through their own state health laws.
Right, so Border Force doesn't have the jurisdiction and ability to spot check, but you give the information to state jurisdictions, and do you know whether they're spot checking, making sure people are actually self-isolating where they say they will be?
Yeah, I understand that some have been. Certainly I'm aware that in Queensland, Queensland Police have been door knocking. What I can say as well is that a lot of the states have actually got quite significant penalties for people who flout the law, who basically try and circumvent this. They sign a form saying they're going to self-isolate and don't. What I would say is also at the border, though, if international passengers come in and they say, well, I'm not going to do that, they refuse to sign the form, or they refuse to, they say they're not going to self-isolate, then we'll look to cancel their visa and send them back. So we can do that under the Migration Act for health purposes, and certainly my guidance to my officers is that we should do that in those cases. Where an Australian says they're not going to isolate or refuse to sign the form, we notify as a matter of course then the state or territory concerned.
Okay, one last question. At airports, there is anecdotal reports and evidence of no temperature checks being done, no temperature checks in sight, and the only real changes, and I'll give you Sydney Airport, I don't want to say all airports, there is no access to smart gates, so you have to line up and actually physically see a customs officer. But the other thing was that there was one person, I don't know whether an Australian Border Force official or not, but seemed to be doing random checks on people, but only really talking to 1 in 200. Is that about correct about what's happening at least Sydney Airport? No,
it's nowhere near correct, Laura. So I've got about 120 officers a day at Sydney Airport. Department of Agriculture, I don't know how many biosecurity officers they have, but it's quite a few. And so the process is that whilst we're doing immigration and customs clearance, that's the Border Force, if we identify any passenger or a passenger themselves self-identifies as being unwell, or an airline tells us a passenger is unwell, then that passenger is automatically referred to a biosecurity officer who then sends them down the line for a health check by a registered nurse from the State or Territory Health Department. Moreover, my officers are roaming around the airport, engaging with passengers, and of course we're still very focused on the number of flights. We focus on certain high-risk flights, but also we're looking for passengers who may appear to be unwell. But bear in mind, this isn't a perfect fail-safe mechanism, because with this virus, unfortunately,
but are you temperature
it's
checking?
Transmissible
and are
before.
people just not seeing
No,
it?
the Border Force don't temperature check. We do customs and immigration clearance.
Right.
Temperature checking is being done by registered medical practitioners at the airports, and they are state and territory nurses who are provided by the states and territories to the airport. There's a line there. I've been through the process myself the other week. I put myself through the process to see what they do, and the nurse takes the temperature of the passenger. If they're over 37.5 or 6, I think it was, they're referred down to a doctor. If less than that, they're given information about how they need to self-isolate and given masks.